This is Book 8, The Last Day in the Forest of the Edge series, written by Trish Mercer, published by Trish Mercer, and read by Trish Mercer. And now, an important note about the chapters. Unlike previous books, I broke this one into chapters by days, since a great deal happens each day. I thought it would be easier for readers, and myself, to keep track of who is where and when. However, that means that some of the chapters are very long. For example, one is over 200 pages. Clearly, I can't just record 200 pages of a chapter, so I need to break these large ones up. Therefore, several chapters will be in parts, such as part 1 of 3, part 4 of 6, etc. I hope it's not going to be too confusing, but I'm sure I can find a way to make it so. Book 8, The Last Day. Chapter 1, 30th Day of Planting, Part 1 of 2. It was the light that woke him up. It was so unusual and bright and intrusive that there was no way he could have slept through it. It poured into the room through a crack in the curtains like a sword slicing the darkness. Young Pere and Shin sat up and looked around in the dim light of the room. Each of the cots surrounding him in Sergeant Major Poe Healy's crowded bedroom was filled with an exhausted and smoky-smelling officer. As much as he wanted to throw open the curtains and feel the sunshine for the first time in 13 days, he didn't want to disrupt anyone's sleep. Now was not the time to have people, especially officers, angry with him. Private Shin crept quietly to the door and opened it. "Going somewhere?" asked an enormous soldier posted in the hallway. Another on the other side of the door raised an eyebrow at him. "To the latrine." "You're supposed to go down the hall there to use the officers' washroom. Can't risk any trouble." What that really meant was they didn't want to risk Private Shin running away instead of relieving himself. All Shin could think was that there were no windows in the hallway, and certainly not in the washroom. The latrine, however, would have afforded a peek at the sun, but that would have to wait. Then again, he'd spent nearly 2 weeks in almost complete darkness while confined in the dungeon below the tower, and the light filtering in around him was already overwhelming. Reluctantly, he headed to the washroom, but then realized it'd be the first time since he'd been released from the dungeon that he wouldn't be standing in his own filth. That made him smile. A few minutes later, he made his way back to where Staff Sergeant Beavid and the 2 guards were waiting for him. Beavid smiled. "Ready for breakfast, Private Shin?" "Yes, sir." "Come on." He led him to the main doors of the officers' quarters. "The general's waiting for you in the command tower. You'll eat with him there." He opened the doors and headed out to the compound. The thought of facing General Thorne for the first time in nearly 2 weeks made Private Shin hesitate. But his yearning to be outside propelled him onward, the 2 massive guards on his heels. He stepped out into the sunshine that was just coming over the horizon and stopped, unable to continue. It was like standing in the presence of the Creator. The sun was so bright, warm, and inviting, as if welcoming him back. His eyes filled with tears, and he felt the need to drop to his knees and worship. He wanted to rip open his uniform to expose every inch of flesh to the sunlight. Not caring who saw him or what they thought, he did the next best thing. He spread out his arms, closed his eyes, and let the tears wash down his cheeks as the light bathed him. How was it that he never noticed before how glorious the sun was? How did he take it for granted for so many years? Unable to ignore the urge anymore, he dropped to his knees, and, disregarding the sniggers of soldiers around him, whispered the only word that came to his mind. "Papa." Over and past the mountains in the valley of Salem, Pedo Shin looked up from his breakfast. He turned to the window and noticed the sun coming over the mountains that enclosed the huge valley, and it hit him. It hit him with such force that he dropped his fork and covered his face with his hands. No one else noticed, too involved with their meal, but his wife did. "What is it, Pato?" Lilla whispered anxiously. Despite the clattering of dishes, noisy conversations, and scattered laughter, the word slid into his ear as a distinct plea, a hopeful declaration of "Papa." Pato trembled, unable to form the words. But realizing his wife's grip on his arm was only going to grow more painful until he said something, he managed to whisper, "Lilla, Young Pere's been freed." He would have knelt there for hours, but he couldn't because a moment later he heard a familiar snicker. "I guess being in the dungeon did do you some good, Shin." The private opened his eyes, took a deep breath of sun-warmed air, which was still cold enough to show his breath, and turned to see General Thorne standing a few feet away, his left hand on his hip, waiting. Now things are going to get complicated. During his bath last night, he understood why he was being released from the dungeon. He was to lead General Lemuel Thorne and the army of Idumea to Salem. He couldn't avoid doing so without losing his life. Before he dozed off, he pondered various strategies for handling the situation. With each scenario, he heard Pugga whisper, "That won't work, but don't worry, we have a plan." But Private Shin had to do something. He dropped his arms and got to his feet. Meekly he said, "Yes, sir," to Thorne, then repeated the speech he had practiced. "I had a great deal of time to think while I was in the dungeon. I'm sorry, sir, for never revealing to you that I was from Salem. I just preferred being your son than being his grandson. I didn't want to lose that. I lost it anyway, though." He looked down at his boots and hoped it had all sounded sincere. Thorne's left hand came off his waist to push up Shin's chin. He held Shin's jaw firmly as he evaluated his cheeks and eyes, probably looking for signs of suffering. Thorne released him to shake the side of Shin's jacket to see how loose it was. Thorne said after a moment. "You look better than I expected, but you're at least a size smaller than you were." Shin wasn't about to tell the general about Qualipo Healy, who was still asleep in his quarters after fighting the wildfire that ravaged part of the makeshift army encampment last night. For the past 2 weeks, Po Healy had been smuggling Shin extra food when he delivered his rations. He even brought him a piece of jerky in the early hours of that morning. "I think the bath I took filled me up again a bit, sir. I've been feeling spongy." "Spongy," Thorne repeated. "Funny." Cocking his head to the command tower, he said, "Hungry?" "Yes, sir." It hadn't been that big a piece of jerky. "Then let's see if you're strong enough to take the stairs, your first climb of the day." Shin followed General Thorne to the tower, deliberately turning his gaze away from the door that led to the records room and his old dungeon home beneath it. He was grateful to realize he could take the stairs so easily. Pugga's daily calisthenics had kept him in shape, but as he reached the top, he made sure he was panting a little for show. Thorne gestured to the large desk that was laid out with a tall stack of pancakes, syrup, salted pork, and even a pitcher of milk. It was a shocking amount of food, considering everyone was on rations. Thorne must have been confident they'd soon find Salem and its storehouses bursting with food, to feel he could be so indulgent for their last breakfast in Edge. Buddy and Pal, Thorne's clumsy and gangly teenage informants, who had visited Private Shin frequently in the dungeon, sat on the other side of the desk. They were wearing big smiles, probably because the private smelled a whole lot better than he used to. "Take it slowly, Shin," he heard another voice. He looked up to see Major Twig smiling cautiously at him. "Men come out of their eating too quickly and they get sick," the major warned. "Thank you, sir." "Good to see you again," Twig nodded. Shin doubted that. Twig's tense demeanor caused his pale skin to always appear stretched too tight. Upon seeing Shin, the lines around Major Twig's mouth vanished completely, and his jaw clenched. Twig had never enjoyed being responsible for Thorne's son. Shin sat down and piled on the food, far too much, and did his best to not eat quickly, but it was difficult. Buddy and Pal chuckled at his enthusiasm, and they filled up their plates. Apparently his new friends would be taking all their meals with him. Thorn sat down on a chair near the desk and watched as Shin shoveled food into his mouth. Eventually he spoke. "We leave in 2 hours and go straight north, climbing over the boulders. I anticipate making camp above the boulder line tonight, unless you know a way to make the journey easier for your fellow soldiers." Shin gulped down some milk and immediately regretted it. His belly churned at the richness. Deciding it was a good time to let his stomach rest, he said to Thorn, "Sir, I don't know of any other way. There were routes through the boulders, but after the eruption—" he shrugged. "I must confess that once I went up through the forest after I noticed it was dead. I couldn't find any of the routes. They all collapsed. Climbing over the boulders is the only way." Thorn tipped his head. "Can't take horses over the boulders now, can we?" Shin shrugged. "Perhaps that's better. Where would you stable the horses? How would you feed them? There's nothing growing on the mountains, sir." He glanced out the window to make sure of that, and his breath caught once again as the sun sparkled cheerfully. Thorn studied him. "You may have a point. Horses would make our journey faster, though." "But, sir, if you don't know where you're going, the speed in which you go doesn't matter, does it?" "So where are we going, Shin?" He turned back to his pancakes. "Sir," Buddy said timidly to the general, "we can watch him now, sir. You can get back to work. We'll keep him company." From the corner of his eye, Private Shin could see the less than subtle wink Buddy sent to Thorn. Thorn ignored his inept spy. "I don't understand why you insist on protecting them, Shin," he said calmly. "In the past week and a half, I found a few more people who know about Salem. It's hardly a place worth preserving. They kidnapped your mother Jatsi and Uncle Pato and kept them hiding all these years. They kidnapped Captain Lick's father, who was also Lieutenant Kaya's father, and forced him to stay in Salem. For many years he tried to leave, but he couldn't. Shem Zenas himself saw to that. But finally Wallachia escaped, nearly losing his life to return to the world. So terrified he was of what he experienced in Salem that he was never fully himself again. When he finally died a few years ago, he was a broken and paranoid man. Tell me, Shin, why defend a place like that?" Shin only stared at his plate and chewed on a pancake while memorizing Thorn's version of events, his already well-practiced story. "And just so you realize these aren't isolated cases, Shin," Thorn continued, "it's recently come to my attention that Salem is holding others captive. Right now, they're holding my wife and her 2 oldest daughters. The one who came to visit us at the mansion was the lucky one who escaped. And even then, she preferred dying in Edge than living in Salem. Now, why is that, Shin? What did Salem do to her, her sisters, and her mother? Lieutenant Kaya is the one who brought me that devastating news about my family. He also lost his life, preferring death in Edge to life in Salem." Shin continued to eat pedantically, feeling the penetrating gazes of Thorn, Twig, and now Po Healy, who had climbed the stairs to listen. Buddy and Pal slowed in their eating, and Beavid, standing in the corner, folded his arms and leaned against the wall. All of them were watching for his response. So, this was the story being told to all of the soldiers. The purpose for invading Salem, provided they could find it. Thorn had years of experience in creating a compelling tale, taking convenient truths and mixing them with lies for his own recipe of rubbish. "They abducted Eltana Jordan close to 2 years ago," Thorn continued in a low, steady voice, calculated to sound both concerned and furious. as if the poor woman hadn't suffered enough with the tragic death of her husband Gary. Shin noticed that Thorne didn't mention that he was the one who arranged that tragic death. They came and stole her away, too. All I can figure is that it was to force her to pay for the crimes of her husband while he was a general in the world. Gary Jordan was a violent, fierce man, Shin. Many people lost their lives because of him. Shin ate even slower, but still didn't look up, or he would have been tempted to say, "But tens of thousands have lost their lives because of you, especially everyone over age 50. "They're holding my wife and daughters, Shin," Thorne continued, adding a slight tremor which almost sounded genuine. "No ransom note, no reason, nothing. Just revenge. That's all I can figure." His tone quavered for a family that he hadn't thought of in years. "I'm not going to allow that, Shin. Why Salemites feel justified in holding innocent women is beyond my imagination. Only a bitter, hateful society would do such a thing. Then again, look at what kind of men they produced." Now his tone shifted to detached, with undercurrents of rage. "Shem Zenas was the most evil, heartless man who ever came to Edge," Thorne declared. "He destroyed the greatest man the army ever produced, your grandfather, by taking advantage of his trust and stealing away his wife." Another shift, and Private Shin wished he'd been taking notes. Thorne's performance was masterful, and he sounded truly distraught as he reminisced. "I knew them, Private. I sat in this very office and watched the two of them laugh like brothers, communicate with a silly secret system of winks and facial tics only they knew. And I saw just how much trust and love, yes, love, Pere and Shin felt for Shem Zenas." Thorne changed again, now agitated. "But Zenas made Perrin into a fool, Private. Tore out his heart and threw it in the mud. Zenas frequently went to their house, supposedly bringing messages. But only Zenas knew how long Perrin would be away from his house, so he could have Mari all to himself. I know because I watched. I saw when Zenas left the fort and when he returned. He was with her more than Perrin was. Shem betrayed him in every way possible. That's the kind of man Salem produces, Private, and those are the kind of men you're trying to shield." Shem pushed his food around on his plate, making swirls in the syrup, while the rest of the soldiers and officers held their breath, waiting to hear what else Thorne would say and if Shin would react. The general's performance was far from over. "One question has been eating at me for the past 12 days, Private," Thorne continued. "Why did you leave? I can't help but wonder what those people did to my son to force him away. They must have known who you were. What they thought of you because I was your father, I can't imagine. I've stayed awake for nights, sick with worry at what they've done to my beautiful Jatesy. What they must have done to you." Shin struggled to keep his face still, so that he wouldn't scoff at the notion that Thorne was ever sick with worry over anyone. "How is it that they can so terrorize you that you flee to Edge with Amory?" "Yes, I know about that too." Thorne tried his best to sound sincere. "She was married to a monster that she ran away from. What I can't understand is, how is it that they can so abuse you to make you risk your life to leave, yet now you can't bring yourself to expose them? They don't deserve your devotion. They deserve to be uncovered, to be cleansed by the army of Idemia." Shin answered nothing, privately musing how the army could cleanse anything. It was like expecting a mud bath to make you sparkly. "The entire army out there now knows about Salem and its evils," Thorne continued in a practiced tone that increased in volume and intensity. "Every last man out there is willing to help me liberate my wife and daughters, to find and rescue Eltana Jordan and everyone else who's a prisoner there. Every last man except you. Salem deserves my retribution for the mistreatment of my son. Salem must pay." Thorn was on his feet now, gesturing furiously with his left arm, while his dead right arm swung erratically as if wanting to assist. "I will see my wife and daughters freed, I promise you. I will not rest until they and Eltana Jordan and everyone else they've dragged away is breathing the sweet air of freedom again. You of all people should understand that today, Shin. I saw you out there, arms outstretched to feel the sun. How many people in Salem are suffering as you were? And for how long? Seasons? Years?" Clearly a response was expected, but Shin was too consumed in trying to spell his last name in the syrup on his plate before the gaps closed in. "You were down in the dungeon for only 12 days. Thorn tried again. "But Salem's been holding its victims for far longer. How can you refuse to help them, Shin, knowing how they suffer? This morning you felt how fantastic it is to be a free man. Why do you deny that to everyone else in Salem? Are you afraid? Is that it? Don't you believe I can protect you?" Growing weary of this game, Shin sat perfectly still, unsure of what to say or do. Thorn had twisted Salem into an object deserving of destruction, and 80,000 soldiers had no way of knowing it was yet another thorny story. The general was brilliant, simply brilliant. Shin would have to be just that much more clever, somehow. "You'll be safe, Shin," Thorn continued, his voice softening. "Those 2 guards at your door this morning, they weren't there to prevent you from running. They were there to protect you. They're at the bottom of the stairs right now, making sure no one can reach you who shouldn't. Sergeant Beavid has put together a team of soldiers designated solely for your protection. These 2 fine privates seated across from me are part of that team, as well as a few others. 9 men, Shin. I've devoted 9 men to staying by your side, protecting you and helping you with anything. You can reveal Salem to us. No harm will come to you because of it. Please, son, Lek." Thorn leaned in close. Shin bristled when he heard son and Lek again. "Let me give you back your rightful name. Tell me how to get to Salem, and you can be Lek Thorn again. Together, we can do amazing things for the world. We can rule it the way it was meant to be ruled. Trust your father. Don't you trust your father?" Shin had heard so many things that were wrong that he wouldn't even know how to begin to address them, but Thorn's last question could be answered. "Sir, I do trust my father," he whispered. "And?" Thorn prodded. Shin dropped his fork and rubbed his head in frustration, but hoped it looked like worry and fear. "General," Healy's voice broke the thick silence. "Consider that much of what you've just said to him is not something he's heard before. Private," he said quietly, "did you know about Thorn's wife and daughters in Salem?" Focusing on his plate, Shin shook his head. "How about Mrs. Jordan or Lick's father?" He shook his head again and held his forehead. "Sir," Healy turned to Thorn, "give him some time to understand all of this. Let him consider, and then maybe he'll be more willing or able." Able he was already, but willing? Never. Then again, if Young Pere gave the appearance of willing, then earned Thorn's trust, then sprang his trap, whatever trap that might be. "Shin," Thorn said, almost kindly, "did you know about the nature of Salem?" "It's not the Salem I know, sir," Shin confessed to the table. "So why did you leave, son?" He shook his head. "Are you afraid to go back?" Another question he could answer honestly. He nodded. He was afraid to face his family again, and the thought that it might happen with Thorn by his side had never occurred to him until that moment. Already he could hear his mother's loud sobs, see his father's look of dismay, his siblings' and cousins' accusatory stares, his grandmother shake her head in disbelief that her grandson would be in the company of her greatest enemy. And what would Guide Zenas think of him? No, Thorn must never make it to Salem. The army, yes, that could somehow work. But Thorn, never. Shin knew what he needed to do. Getting there, however, was going to be difficult. Thorn sighed, realizing no further progress would be made and that they were wasting time. Finish eating, then Beavid will take you to get acquainted with your security team. In 2 hours, we start climbing to Salem. I hope you're ready. You're leading the way. It was an odd mix of feelings for Private Shin to be freed from the dungeon and once again out in the world, cautiously walking on the icy patches to avoid the muddy sections of the dead forest, and feeling the sun trying feebly to warm the air that was still unseasonably cool. It was almost too many sensations after dark nothingness, and although he felt dazed by light and sounds, he reveled in the bombardment of his senses. He chose his entrance to the forest deliberately, the new meadow his father had created last year. It would have been easier to pick his way through the deadened forest like the majority of the army was, but Peido Shin had created this meadow as a diversion, sending a boulder at the top of it, rolling down to trigger an avalanche of dead timbers which terrified the army. And it still did, judging by how many men purposely avoided the tree fall area. Into that scar which his father had inflicted on the forest, Shin willingly marched, his security team reluctantly following. Today, the messy and massive triangle shape of felled trees was an arrow, pointing north to the boulder field, pointing to his home. If it were just him heading north, the day would have been perfect. But knowing he was leading the army to that home sent his spirits to the bottom of his boots. Something had to happen before he reached Salem. He just had to pay attention and wait for the right moment to do whatever. At the top of the triangular scar, Shin continued northward, eventually reaching the end of the trees and the beginning of the boulder field. He hadn't dared look behind to see his massive audience following, but the army was a noisy bunch, crunching branches and shouting for no good reason. Their close presence hovered menacingly behind him, and they were all watching as he stopped to survey the vast boulder field before him. His security team of 9 stood behind him, waiting for him to choose a route. Thorn lurked to the side like a stalking mountain lion, accompanied by Pohili and Amory. Gone was her typically revealing dresses. Today she wore trousers, a man's work shirt, and surprisingly sensible boots. Behind them, a dozen officers waited for Shin to choose a boulder and start heaving his dungeon-weakened body onto it. Beyond, the 80,000 soldiers waited for the tall private to make the first move, as if he had some bizarre and amazing skill, and this would be his only performance. He tipped his head at the immense obstacle before him, trying to delay as long as possible. It's all the same, really, isn't it? I mean, it's just all house-size boulders with a few horse-size boulders tossed in for variety. Not like there's some perfect place to start. So climb already, Thorn thundered. After jumping slightly, Shin made his way to a crevice between 2 boulders, knowing that his heavy pack filled with his rations, water flasks, and bedroll, and spare clothing would likely shift with each movement, potentially throwing him off balance and maybe off of the rock. But this wasn't a time for stage fright. He'd planned this performance, and he hoped that the agonizingly long minutes he was currently spending, bracing and heaving and struggling, would convince the thousands behind him that climbing the boulder field would be a stupid and exhausting endeavor. Best to break their will before they even touched a rock. Finally, he was on top of the first rock, with about 40 more ahead of him, and he was wondering how he could make that take even longer when he heard a strange noise behind him. He glanced back to see that much of the army was cheering. He wasn't used to being applauded in the world. He waved, half in embarrassment, half in amusement, before turning back to the boulders and being purposely slow about selecting the next one. "Everyone get climbing!" Thorne bellowed, gesturing wildly with his left arm, and the cheering stopped. The first line of thousands of men apprehensively approached the boulders, trying to find the best place to grip the smooth rock. Well, it was only a matter of time, Shin thought to himself. They'd realize that anywhere along the 7-mile-wide barrier was as good as any, and soon it'd be swarming with men in blue. "This isn't so hard," he heard one of the massive guards behind him say. That one was called Iron, or Hammer. While they weren't quite as tall as Young Pere, the blond men were definitely beefy. The blacksmiths, perhaps in their late 20s, were perfectly suited for the rigors of the climb. "Speak for yourself. Ugh!" A man in his mid-30s who they called Teach groaned behind him. He was in for a very long day, with his paunchy belly and his floppy body, which saw no more exercise than what was required to slap a stick on a misbehaving boy's arm. "There's got to be smaller rocks somewhere. Right over there. Look at that. Why didn't we start over there?" Shin smirked as he heard another of his security team comfort Teach. "It's not so bad once you look at the rocks in the right way." "And what way would that be, Cloudman?" Teach asked derisively. Shin wondered why they called him that. He was just medium height, not tall enough to have his head hit the clouds, and he was rather average in every way. His dark skin and short curly black hair looked like a fourth of the soldiers. While on the younger side, maybe only a couple years older than him, Shin would hardly have noticed Cloudman if he didn't speak. But as soon as he opened his mouth, Shin understood. "Think of the boulders as brown clouds, gray clouds, all kinds of shapes and bumps. They've fallen to the ground for us to explore. How nice!" Shin smiled when he heard Teach grunt as he attempted to scale another rock. But his smile faded when he saw Pal crawling over, probably to ingratiate himself once again. "Gracina survivor," Pal explained, jerking his head toward Cloudman behind them. "Vilehead?" Cloudman was now standing on a boulder, taking deep breaths and grinning to the world. "There's a surprising amount of them still around," Pal said quietly, as if complaining to his best friend. They tried to scatter the Vileheads through the ranks so that no one had an undue amount to deal with. Shin glanced back to see if Buddy might be trying to join them for his attempt at friendliness, but instead noticed Teach lying on his stomach across a boulder, seemingly unable to find a hand or foothold. Then again, it wasn't as if he was really trying. Another soldier with black hair, medium brown skin, and a determined air about him was trying to show Teach where to put his hands. They called him Reg, Shin remembered, meaning regular army. "You were one too, weren't you?" "What?" Shin said, realizing that Pal was still trying to get chummy with him. "Oh, yeah, Gracina boy, for a time, yes." They inched their way up a boulder. "I never did the vials," Pal said conversationally, then hinted, "I always wondered why people did them." "Not sure why I did them either." Shin hoped his curt tone might discourage Pal, but nope. Maybe, Pal grunted as he squeezed into a crevice that Teach with his flabby middle would never visit. "Maybe to forget, like past troubles, a disturbing childhood. I've heard the vials do that." "I'm not sure, I forgot." "Funny," Pal said. Shin nearly rolled his eyes, but instead looked up and did a double take. How did you get up there already?" The soldier standing on the boulder ahead of him sneered down, as if regarding a rotting corpse. "It's not really that difficult. Need a hand, Shin?" Pal shuddered next to him. "Snarl is surprising us daily with his abilities," he said under his breath. Looking up at the soldier, he said, Is rock climbing another skill? Snarl's lips turned into an ugly smile, and Shin understood his nickname. He was maybe 30 years old, with deep-set eyes, greasy dirt-brown hair, and a pinched face that was difficult to look at for more than a couple of seconds. Scaling block walls up to a second-level bedroom is far more difficult than this. What were you doing, climbing up to... Pal stopped, not wanting to know the answer. Shin surveyed the rock before him. I don't need your help, but I think Teach will need some soon. He glanced back to see Beavid and Reg rolling Teach off the boulder, effectively trapping him in the crevice behind. A loud moan came from the rock, and Beavid shook his head in aggravation. Snarl waved. Hammer, go get Teach. Throw him over your shoulder or something. I'll keep an eye on Shin. Think of them as clouds, Teach, came an encouraging voice. Doesn't that cloud jabbing into your back feel nice? Shin heard chuckling on the other side. Buddy had finally joined them, encasing him in informants. Look at Cloudman jumping on these rocks. He must be part goat. Probably his mother, Snarl sniggered. He turned back to the rock before them, scanning the area. All clear, Shin boy. You may climb without fear of running into anyone unpleasant. Shin was sure he already had. He heard protests behind him. No, I will not be carried. Get your hands off of me. I can do this myself. Shin finished scaling the boulder in front of him and turned around to see Teach thrown over the shoulder of Hammer. Iron was leaning against a boulder and chuckling as Hammer tried to tackle the rock in front of him with the extra weight. You'll drop me, I know it, Teach bellowed, gripping Hammer in terror while also trying to find a way to get off of his shoulder. Then move yourself, Sergeant Beavid shouted at him. I will, just put me down. This is so undignified. Cloudman jumped to another boulder below Shin and started up it. Move along, Private, he called cheerfully. I can't wait to see the view from the top. Do you want to go ahead of me, Cloudman? Can I? Can I? Shin grinned at his enthusiastic dog-like expression. Just stay out of Snarl's way. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, Cloudman whispered excitedly as he easily made his way past and joined Snarl on the next level of boulders. Snarl didn't look pleased to have the company. Phew, Buddy exclaimed as he pulled his body out of a tight crevice. This is going to get tiring. I've never done anything like this before. Have you, Shin? Have you ever climbed rock like this before when you were younger? Shin smiled internally. It wasn't as if he had worried that the boredom he had experienced in the dungeon would continue once he was out, but he realized that between keeping an eye on Snarl, whose past life must have been unpleasantly interesting, and avoiding giving clues about his childhood to Thorn's clumsy young spies, and watching the less-than-toned soldiers around him trying to extract themselves from crevices designed for skinnier men, and waiting for whatever unpredictable thing Cloudman would do next, well, in the moments where he wasn't fretting about leading the army to Salem, he'd be quite entertained. The four men in gray and black mottled clothing hadn't said a word for the past hour. Flat on their bellies, they peered from the overlook at the mouth of the canyon to watch the activity well below them at the boulder field. Once the first soldiers of thousands began swarming the rock, they knew. It was starting. One of the men pulled out a spyglass and focused on the soldiers in the lead. He held his breath as he searched the masses in blue clothing. The three around him also tensed, waiting for the news. Yes, the first man said. It's him. He exhaled in relief. But his companions were still anxious. Woodson, one of them began, but if it's him... To their astonishment, Woodson smiled. He rarely smiled. As the head of the scouting corps for Salem, he was responsible for everyone who was going into the world and coming back out again. That he was smiling because tens of thousands of men in blue were invading the very forest where he was born over 40 years ago befuddled his companions. Even odder, Woodson was smiling at who was leading those soldiers in his forest. The same young man who had ruined Woodson's reputation of never losing a scout, refugee, or Salemite. The Shin's middle grandson had tricked Woodson to join his emergency scouting party to retrieve an ill rector. Then that boy escaped into the world with another runaway from Salem, Amory Reiling. But right now, the deep lines on Woodson's leathery tanned face seemed cheerful. That made his scouting corps nervous. "It's him," Woodson repeated confidently. "And he's unarmed. Take a look." He handed the glass to another man. "Every soldier out there has got some kind of weapon stashed on him, but not him. The men around him, however, all have Army-issued long knives and swords. That's important. That means something." The scouts around him began to smile hesitantly as well. One of them nodded. "That means it's time for you to go and make a report. Be careful, Woodson. We'll stay here and track their progress for as long as we can." "But not for too long," Woodson whispered back. "I can't imagine where Thorne thinks all of them are going to camp tonight, but some might make it up here before nightfall." "Understood." Woodson and another scout slid backward from their position, wiping the ashy dirt behind them so as to make the earth look undisturbed. Once they reached the narrow ravine that opened to the canyon behind them, they stood up, sprinted along the narrow riverbank to their horses, and raced for the hidden glacial fort. Peto was in the orchard looking longingly at his trees. Still nothing. No buds, no blossoms, nothing. It wasn't too late yet. Something still might come, he kept telling himself. He caressed the trunk of one of his favorite peach trees and analyzed its branches. "Papa," a quiet voice said next to him, "it's all right. Think about it this way. If there's no fruit, there's no picking up mushy, rotten peaches off the ground. There's also no raccoons raiding the orchard or bees bothering—" Sakal's voice trailed off, realizing that with no fruit, there was also a lot more that would be suffering. Peto smiled and put his arm around his 13-year-old daughter, who regarded being outside as a punishment. "You're right, Sakal," he said sunnily, knowing his children took their cues from his mood. "Maybe the orchard just needs to rest for a year. You certainly won't mind not coming out here and fighting the hornets for apples now, will you?" Sakal leaned against him. "That's right," she said, borrowing his brightness. "Besides, we have plenty of dried fruit." My favorite," Peto said, trying to sound sincere. "Tough, chewy fruit, shriveled for traveling and storing convenience. So much better than having juice dribbling down your chin after you've bitten into a fresh peach." Sakal grinned at his ridiculously merry tone. "I'll miss the blackberries, though," she confessed. "So you'll appreciate them even more next year, right?" "Right." They strolled back to the house, the sun hovering in the mid-afternoon sky. A layer of brownish cloud looking like old ash was slipping in front of it, filtering out the sun's brightest rays and causing the air to chill around them again. Peto felt Sakal shiver, and he wrapped his arm tighter around her. "Where's your coat?" "I left it inside when I saw the sun was out. I thought it'd be warmer." "So did I." He rubbed her arm covered by only a thin cotton sleeve. Mid-planting season was usually much warmer than this. She snuggled closer as they walked, not only for warmth, but for comfort. "Papa, do you really think next year the world will remember how to warm up again?" "I have no way of knowing what the world will do, Sakal. I just have to hope it will. Hope can get us through a great many worrisome days." "Like today?" "Oh, today's not so bad," Peto said breezily. "Usually the trees show signs of doing something by now, but if they need to rest this year, after such a long snowing season, that's all right. We have plenty to see us through, right? Right?" Sakal smiled at her father's optimism. As long as he was cheerful, she could be too. The chimes from the nearby messenger tower caused them both to pause and watch the banners rise. Red emergency banner, general's banner, now the banner for Rector Peto Shin, guide's banner. Sakal swallowed hard and watched her father's face. Peto stared at the tower as the last signal went up. Solid gray banner. Peto couldn't breathe. He'd seen that banner only once, more than 25 years ago, when his own father had delivered them to the towers. He knew it was only a matter of time before it was hoisted, but suddenly that time was right now, and the future was abruptly shortened. Only his daughter, clutching his arm, shook him out of astonishment. "Papa? Gray Banner?" Sakal asked nervously. "Yes," he said slowly, unable to pull his eyes away from it. After waiting for so many years for something to happen, it was happening. "It means that the army of Idemia is on the move," he told her somberly. "They're on the boulders." In the large pasture behind the Brider's house, Dek, 20-year-old Vidro, and 12-year-old Atli were counting the expecting cows as their brother-in-law Lek, further up in the corral, marked them with a dab of yellow chalk on their rumps. The task wouldn't take long since the herd was only a few dozen animals, but they were smiling because all of the cows were expecting. The herd would be growing, life was returning. The four of them paused when they heard the chimes, and they watched the banners go up. Their smiles turned to worried frowns. Confused, Vidro and Atli looked at each other when they saw the gray banner rise. Lek dropped from the fence he was straddling and jogged over to them. "Gray banner?" Vidro asked his brother-in-law. Lek looked at Dek, who had turned white. "Papa Dek?" Dek's hand covered his mouth, dragging down his face. "Yes," he whispered. "Gray." "Deket!" Jatsi was running from the back door, 10-year-old Yanali and 9-year-old Young Shem following on her heels. "Deket! Do you see it?" Only when his wife was panicked did she call him by his full name. Dek caught her as she rushed through the gate. "Jatsi, calm down. It's only gray. It's not black." "But Dek—" I know what it means, but—" Peto!" Jatsi shouted when she saw her brother striding from his orchard to the lane that led to the Zenas' house. Peto waved. "As soon as I know, I'll tell you. Don't panic." "Too late," Dek called back as Peto took off on a jog. "So what does a gray banner mean?" Vidro demanded. Lek looked at his in-laws. "It means the army of Idemia is moving beyond Edge. They're climbing the boulder field." Jatsi turned to her husband. "Go, follow Peto, find out what's happening." Dek tried his best calming tone, the one he used for the most agitated cows. "The messenger with the details won't arrive for at least another 10 or 15 minutes. This doesn't mean they're invading. It only means they're on the move. Perrin made all sorts of gray banners, if I remember correctly, to designate what the army was doing and where. As long as the banners remain gray, we're fine. Vidro can keep planning his wedding, and you can keep worrying about making the dinner afterward with the new in-laws." "That's still 6 weeks away, Dek," Jatsi said. "Will our son still get to take his bride in 6 weeks?" Vidro shifted nervously, his gaze darting between his father and mother. Yanali and Young Shem whimpered quietly. Dek turned to his fourth son. "All you really need is to hold her hands while Rector Shin says a few words. No huge gathering, no big meal. You don't even need your house finished. You can stay with us." "Papa," Vidro said, growing restless, "she won't know what gray means. If you don't mind, I'd like to go—" Lek patted him on the back as Dek said, "Her parents will know what a gray banner means. Tell her we can do it here or at her parents' house. Tonight, even. It doesn't matter where, just as long as it gets done." Vidro took off for the barn. A moment later, he was riding Clark 14 bareback to the southern part of Salem where his fiancée lived. In the Shin's home, Lila stood at the large front window staring at the tower. Sakal, 11-year-old Sentia, and 9-year-old Mora were by her side. "I never thought I would see it. I mean, I knew someday I'd see it again, not just when Papa Pere had them laid out on the eating table, explaining why he chose gray to represent Idemia, but I just didn't think it would be now. I mean, with Everything and all, it only makes sense that I should see it again, but to actually see it up there, flying on the tower. Mari smiled at her babbling daughter-in-law. She wrapped an arm around 15-year-old Q, who stood close to his grandmother in case she needed supporting. She was strong and steady, but she wanted Q to feel useful anyway. Remember, Lilla, it only means the army is moving. It doesn't mean it's being successful. I can just imagine them trying to climb those boulders, she chuckled. Kind of wish I could see them flopping like lost fish on the rocks. She watched the previously unused banner, still with creases in it from its many years of being folded, flapping in the breeze. Perrin had folded it. Those creases were because of him. She knew her smile was growing, and it was terrible to be so happy at a time like this, but she couldn't help it. Perrin was now climbing the boulders on his way back to her. And that is the end of Part 1 of 2, Chapter 1, The 30th Day of Planting. Thank you.